Addressing climate change is both a global and a local challenge. It is also one that the Yoon administration will be dealing with over the next 5 years as it shapes its policies on economic competitiveness, energy, and national security. While South Korea is only the world's 13th largest emitter of greenhouse gases, on a per capita basis, it is one of the world's most significant emitters. Largely due to its highly industrialized economy, South Korea emits 11.7 tons of carbon dioxide per capita. This places it among the world's most carbon-intense economies. Excluding smaller economies such as the Faroe Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, and Luxembourg, the only economies with larger per capita emissions than South Korea are the United States and Canada. The prior Moon administration took two significant steps to address South Korea's emissions that the new South Korean president, Yoon Suk-Yeol, has inherited. In 2020, South Korea pledged to become carbon neutral by 2050, and at COP26 in Glasgow last year, Seoul pledged to reduce its emissions by 40% by 2030 from 2018 levels. The Yoon administration has pledged to uphold both of these pledges. While the Climate Action Tracker has assessed South Korea's pledge to reduce emissions by 40% this decade as insufficient, meeting this target will be a challenge for South Korea. In 2019, industry accounted for 28.4% of South Korea's GDP. In contrast, only 16.4% of the European Union's GDP came from industry, while only 11% of the United States' GDP is from industry. Because South Korea's emissions reductions will need to take place in a little less than a decade, they will also need to proceed at a faster pace than other major economies. Preliminary estimates also suggest that this challenge will be made more difficult because last year, South Korea's emissions are believed to have risen for the first time since they peaked in 2018. If South Korea is unable to achieve its 2030 emissions reductions, its goal of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050 will also likely be out of reach. With the Yoon administration in office until May 2027, the course it charts on South Korea's energy policy will determine whether South Korea is able to achieve its objectives. Beyond climate change, another factor, however, for the Yoon administration will be South Korea's long-term economic competitiveness. Government rules and corporate policies in multiple countries are moving in a direction that will place pressure on South Korea to reduce its emission. The United States, the European Union, for example, are entering into talks to establish standards for reducing emissions from steel. As two of South Korea's largest export markets for steel, new US and EU standards will shape the emissions targets of South Korea's steel industry. Global corporations are also going to be a factor. Major firms, such as Apple, have begun requiring their suppliers to move towards carbon neutrality. In some cases, South Korean firms, especially semiconductor firms, may be able to meet these pledges by supplying semiconductors to major firms from factories outside of South Korea. However, over time, this would hollow out South Korea's own manufacturing sector. National security will likely also be a factor in the Yoon administration's climate and energy policies. With price increases and fuel shortages resulting from Russia's war in Ukraine, South Korea will need to focus in the near term on how to secure its energy supply chains. Seoul is dependent on energy imports for nearly all of its energy supply, with Russia accounting for about 9% of South Korea's fossil fuels. Specifically, Russia accounted for 6% of South Korea's crude oil imports last year, about 5% of its LNG imports, and 17.5% of South Korea's imports of coal. In the short term, the Yoon administration will need to work with allies to ensure adequate energy supplies, especially if there are further restrictions on imports from Russia. But another way to strengthen South Korea's energy security would be to advance plans to transition to renewable fuels and lessen South Korea's dependence on fossil fuels, something that would work in tandem with the administration's emissions reduction efforts. Whether it is for reasons of international cooperation, economic competitiveness, or national security, climate change and energy policy will remain a focus of the Yoon administration over the next 5 years.